All right, well, welcome to the Fort Des Moines Museum. It's good to see you all here today. My name is Jeff Cleaver. I'm on the board of directors for the Fort Des Moines Museum, and this is the first of what will be 6 speaker series held here at the Fort. The project is being funded by Athene, who've generously donated to allow us to do this speaker series, and has provided funds for us to not only hold the series, but also film the series so that we can post it online and more people can learn about the history and the stories here at Fort Des Moines. The story you're going to hear today is a story that we at the Fort were not familiar with 3 or 4 years ago when George reached out to us. You would think that we are focused on a very unique story here, that we would know every single person who came through here, and the fact is that we don't. And so we are constantly learning more about the men and women who served here and the work that they did, not just at the Fort, but the legacy of service that they provided for the remainder of their lives. And today we're going to learn about one of those gentlemen here who was here in 1917 and about the legacy that he left behind in his work of service through the rest of his life. So, George.
All right, thank you. And thanks for coming, and I know we're being taped. Again, thank you very much. I did come prepared. Now, I'm from Pennsylvania. I did fly out prepared to do a PowerPoint, but I brought my smaller laptop. It does not hook up, so you're going to have to just listen to me. I guess I'll do my best to entertain you all. I will say I'm never for a loss of words, but thank you for having me. I came out here, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, really fell in love with the Fort and the mission of the Fort and the history of the Fort. And my story begins right before COVID. I belong to a lot of different groups, organizations, and I work with most of the ethnic groups in our area. So I work with the Muslim community, the Buddhist community, the Hindu community, and we try to bring everybody together. That's the goal, is togetherness. When I brought stories, I put them together like in a book called We Are You, because we're all immigrants. And I have a chairman from Del Valle University. I have an immunologist from Gabon. I have a nurse from the Philippines. So I try to bring everybody from different backgrounds to tell their stories. When my project was complete, the head of the local hospital told me to go look up this Frank Boston, this local hero that seems to have been forgotten. Well, I did. But just when I'm looking at Frank Boston, COVID hits. We're all told 2 weeks, flatten the curve. Well, 2 weeks turns into a year and a half. But I had a lot of time to do research. So I assembled a group of college students, high school students, some other volunteers, and we started digging into the background of Dr. Boston. And what we found was remarkable, enough that it brought me out here as soon as COVID lifted, because I wanted to come see the Fort for myself. I like to trace history and try to understand it. Doc Boston was born in 1890. He went to medical school in Philadelphia, graduated in 1915 with a medical degree and a pharmacy degree. Went to work at the Mercy Hospital, because in Philadelphia, the Mercy Hospital was where black doctors were allowed to treat patients. White hospitals still did not allow black doctors to treat patients. The war breaks out, 1917. Boston enlists, just like his father before him. In fact, we trace the Boston family back to, I think, 1760. His father had served with the Pennsylvania 12th in the Civil War. But the Civil War was the same thing. Even up north, the Pennsylvania did not allow blacks necessarily to join the army until Lee and his Confederate Army was moving towards Pennsylvania, and the dialogue seemed to change. And then it was like, no, you misunderstood. No, come on down. And I believe it was about 8,600 black soldiers volunteered to serve during the Civil War out of Pennsylvania. Boston's father, Charles, was one of them, and he served with the Pennsylvania 12th. Well, like his father before him, war breaks out. Boston says, hey, I'm a doctor. I want to go serve my country. But he's told, no, you have to go to a small fort in Iowa, because that's where the black officers are gathering, which is right here at Fort Des Moines. So Boston comes out here in 1917, trains, and actually goes over to France and serves with the 92nd as a field surgeon and a doctor. He returns from the war, goes back to Pennsylvania, and his passion, though, seemed to be really excited by what he saw and what he could accomplish by being a doctor and a surgeon. So the first thing he starts is an ambulance corps called the First Aid Volunteer Squad, which becomes the Volunteer Medical Services Corps. By 1933, that is formed. He designs a patch that they wear to this day. He makes them wear uniforms. They train, they become really a paramilitary unit. And just think of each slide as I'm telling you this story, because I should be like pointing to the slide. You would have saw this beautiful insignia. The first ambulance, one of the local body shops actually takes a car, chops it up, and extends it to make them their first ambulance. And this is in a small town called Lansdale, Pennsylvania. Lansdale was a white community. And I think it's important to tell you how a black doctor from Philadelphia makes it to Lansdale. So Boston's in Philadelphia. Lansdale's probably 15, 20 miles out of Philly. But it's on one of the train paths, because as the country developed, small towns grew up along the train routes. So he liked to fish on a river called the Perkiomen, which is just a small river outside of Lansdale. He befriends a fellow named Clarence Kratz. One day, Kratz hurts his ankle and Boston tends to him. And Kratz talks him into settling into this white town as a doctor. And Boston does. The side story to that is Kratz had one daughter, Althea Kratz. Her married name is Althea Kratz Hoddle. She goes on to become the first female dean of the University of Pennsylvania. She becomes the president of the AAWU and leads the charge to integrate that organization. And I am convinced, and I've asked Penn for all of her notes, I am convinced it was Boston's influence that allowed Althea to do the things that she did. But he settles in this Lansdale area. He starts his ambulance corps. I do joke in some respects, because now he has an ambulance corps, they didn't have a hospital. So now he has to form a hospital. And they take a single home on a corner, 7th and Broad, and they convert it into a hospital. It's called the Elm Terrace Hospital. And that grew and grew. It moved across the street to become the North Penn Hospital. And from the North Penn Hospital became the Lansdale Hospital, now part of Jefferson Health Systems. And it's thriving, it's bigger than ever. The ambulance corps still exists to this day. It now is in 11 towns, also an Army depot up in the Pocono Mountains. And they also provide transit to CHOP, which is Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So his vision to get these things going and off the ground, to this day is thriving. Boston on the family side. His brother, Samuel, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's medical school in 1898. So you would think, and I don't have an answer. What's been asked of me many times is how his father was a janitor, his mother was a hairdresser. So this is late 1800s, early 1900s. How did those set of parents get two young men into medical school? And I don't have an answer. I really don't. I've researched, I've tried to find an answer, other than to tell you they had to be the most gifted, talented, and ambitious young men at a time that blacks, were certainly not afforded any opportunities to get into medical school. Samuel graduated from Penn 1898. He also enlisted. We believe they were the first set of African-American black doctors to enlist in the military. The sad point, though, is Samuel passed away in 1924. So it was unfortunate, but the family actually produced two doctors. Our research shows that Boston was the first black to start both a hospital and an ambulance corps in the United States. There were hospitals started, but not both. We also believe that his ambulance corps he is the face of EMS for this country. And I've gone to DC, I've gone to the EMS Museum, and I have pushed that because at the time, I talked to a history professor 2 weeks ago, Professor Andrew Simpson. When he was at Carnegie Mellon, he wrote an article about the early ambulances and the history of the ambulances. So I tracked them down. And the one thing I taught for a while, so I always encourage people, knock on any door, because that's what's going to happen. They slam it or they don't talk to you. But I find when I research and if I find an article or other research I like, I go to the source. So I tracked him down. He's at Duquesne University. I sent him an email saying, I'm working on a project. I saw your quote and I want to talk to you. And here was his quote. As late as the 1960s, half of the ambulances in the United States were hearses. They were run by funeral homes. I certainly didn't know that. I'm like, funeral homes? So the professor gives me time and I actually chat with him on the phone. And he said, look, you know, once you moved out of the cities in the rural areas, the funeral cars were the only things long enough to stick the people in. So they were literally going to the accidents to take you to the hospital. And I guess if you didn't make it, they were taking you from the hospital the other way. But I said, Boston was doing this in the 30s. He would jump into the ambulance and ride along to the scenes. He would treat people. He trained his team. They wear uniforms. And what we did, and again, my apologies, because I would have had some great photos for you. And going back to saying I sit on a lot of different boards, the one thing, and again, I always encourage everybody, talk to everybody. You just never know who you're talking with. You just don't. So I sit on the board of the International Spring Festival. It's in its 34th year. We have groups from, you name it, they're involved in our festival. Once a year, this year it's April 15th, we get 7,000 people to attend our event. Well, I was going to meetings and a fellow from Vietnam happens to be on one of the panels with me. His name is Khoi Pham. He comes up to me when he heard about me working on this Boston project and he said, well, what about a comic book? I'm like, I can't even draw a stick figure. Comic book? My son's here, and I mentioned the name to my son, and he said, Dad, you might want to Google the name. Well, I Googled Marvel, you know, and then Khoi Pham. He's done a couple hundred. He does Spider-Man, the Avengers. If you go home now and put in Marvel and Khoi Pham, I was like, so I immediately like, Khoi, remember that offer? Yes. And he designed this Boston comic for us. And this comic is based on a real life event. So my name's on it. Obviously, I can't draw. I didn't write the script. But it is my story. Because in 1936 in Pennsylvania, we had hurricanes and flooding in an area called Lock Haven. The governor of Pennsylvania called upon Boston and his volunteer team to go there because they were one of the few organized first aid ambulance squads in existence in Pennsylvania. So they went up, they're credited with saving lives. There's lots of newspaper articles complimenting Boston and his team. As I said, they were almost like a military unit when they went up to Lock Haven. What we did to bring it to more modern times is we have a group of kids from all different backgrounds to help Boston and his reliable nurse, Mabel Reed, which I'll get to shortly about her participation in all of this. And then the kids, we have different backgrounds. I won't embarrass people sitting in this room, but at least one person has a person named after them, but she'll be speaking later. And another person, I use his middle name. But it has helped us with school kids. Because what we find is I could stand up here now and tell you all these great things about Boston and why we should recognize them. But, people will tune you out after a couple minutes, and, I get that. I'm a realist. As I said, I was a teacher for a long time. So, I know what works and what doesn't. If I'm talking to younger kids, if I can say the guy that did Spider-Man now has a different message for you, we have found that kids are open enough and get excited to say, oh man, yeah, I want to read it. And in the very back of our comic, of course, is we give the history, of Dr. Boston and what he accomplished during his lifetime, which is incredible. I told you I interviewed a lot of the people that had been patients of his. They're in their 80s and 90s. One woman told me, I guess she was like 94, 95. Her father had been a pilot, and he landed at LaGuardia. which is an airport in New York. He had an appendix problem. Rather than go to a hospital in New York, he said, the only person touching me is Doc Boston, drove down to Lansdale to have Boston operate on him. And I got almost the same story from so many of these other people that I interviewed. It was just remarkable. Like, who was this guy? I talked to the daughter of a woman who served as his cook. Now, Boston wound up having a horse farm in Bucks County. He rode horses. And again, when you think of the 40s and 50s, you don't picture an African American having a farm with a couple dogs running around, St. Bernard, by the way, named Tiny, and 2 horses. And he had a living cook, because he was a doctor, he ran the ambulance corps. She used to prepare meals for him and stick him in his trunk. He would make house calls, because again, going back to the 40s, you're just coming out of the Depression, late 30s, 40s. He knew the families that needed food. He would deliver meals to them. And when I've presented this to some of the school kids, I really do say he was the original Uber Eats. Because he was doing it, I got almost 100 years before Uber Eats was doing it, but he didn't want anyone to know. And he refused, to get credit. He didn't want the housekeeper or the people knowing he was doing these things, because he said the families were struggling enough, it would be embarrassing on them. And the more I hear these stories coming from people that knew him, the more dedicated I got to bringing this fella to life. And one more reason why I'm standing here now, and I'm going to help Fort Des Moines also. So in 1959, he's diagnosed with cancer. He's the head of surgery for the hospital. He's diagnosed with cancer, he's dying. His supporters go to the hospital trustees and ask that a portrait be commissioned and hung. The trustees say no. If we did it for Boston, we'd have to do it for everyone else. He dies in 1960, but word spreads about this refusal to hang his portrait. His supporters get so angry, they raise money and they build a monument that exists to this day. It is at 7th and Broad Street. And I don't know, it's a shame, again, I don't have a slide. The monuments say it's about maybe 10, 12 feet long, maybe about 3 feet high. And in the middle is a bronze face of Boston. But instead of him looking straight, it's on an angle. And it was on an angle purposely, because back then he would have been looking at the steps of the hospital. So every time the trustees came out, he'd be giving them the eye. True story, I talked to the daughter of the guy that designed the sculpture. And in a way, just staring at them, like, how dare you not recognize this guy and just kind of let this fella slip away to, oblivion. No one knows. So we came along, and I'm happy to report, since then, the hospital, which is now Jefferson, heard of the story. A portrait was hung last year in a big ceremony. The governor of Pennsylvania signed a law. The street, Broad Street, where his monument is now dedicated to, it's called the Frank E. Boston Memorial Highway. Last week, Jefferson Health Systems gave us the MLK Service Award for bringing the story to life. Senator Grassley last year recognized us, Casey, Senator Ernst, Congress. 3 days ago, I got a letter from General Dingle, who is the commanding officer of the Army Medical Corps, because I am knocking at the door of the White House. And every time I get a chance to talk, I say that's next, because I think what he did should be recognized, because he's a first in so many categories. And this was a poster that Jefferson actually had done up. I have 6 of them. But during his lifetime, he actually got 2 presidential citations, one from Eisenhower, one from Truman. So he was actually very recognized during his lifetime. He was the first African-American member of the military surgeons and became a lifetime member. He was the commander of the VFW post in our area. Of course, founder of a hospital ambulance. We believe he's the leader in EMS. And of course, his brother also being a doctor make them some of the first to appear. in addition, and I think I can get this up, because I think if I can, there's a few more things I want to add, and then I'm going to have Uwe talk to you also about why our work is important. And again, my apologies about not having, I don't know if you can all see this. I'm going to hold this up. Now, our intent is to make a permanent impression, not just of Doc Boston, but of all the fellows that came through here. Because the people that came through here was a who's who of the early civil rights movement. Did it disappear? Oh, that's my Shelby. I shouldn't be showing that. It was up. You all saw it? Yeah. Because again, my apologies. I thought I'd have. All right. And just so you all can see, what we're doing, thanks to Zach and Uli, is we're putting an application in. I'm letting them run with that part to get a U.S. postage stamp. And all they can say is no. But I think we have enough traction going on right now for this project to potentially get a U.S. postage stamp. It takes 3 years. And again, what are they going to say? They say, all right, they say no thank you, or they turn us down. But we have enough momentum. What I also want to commend about this fort, I did a little booklet, and I'm working on it now. When I was researching Boston, W.E.B. Du Bois was an early civil rights leader, was writing letters to Doc Boston about his experiences in World War I. And the more I checked into the history of this fort, Du Bois was one of the supporters of the fort. And what they wanted to do is to make sure that the black men that came here were accomplished. So it did become a who's who of accomplished blacks of that time period. One, Louis Wright, went back to New York, was the president of the NAACP for about 30 years. Hamilton left here, started the equivalent of the American Bar Association, but the Bar Association for black lawyers, because they weren't allowed into the American Bar Association. You have Boston starting a hospital and an ambulance corps. One of the fellows, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, recently was honored. He received the highest award that France has to give. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery. And more, I looked at some of these fellows that got out of here, and I'm like, you know, and they all went back to different places in the country. Why wasn't I ever taught, you know, any of that? And I don't be critical. I'm all about trying to bring everybody together, because there really is only one history. There's not white history, there's not black history, there's just history. But, you know, when I started doing this project, I found that there was a lot of history I knew nothing about. And in a way, the more I delved into this, the more I felt it's time that we revisit things and simply say there's more to the story. And men like Boston really need to be commended. Then before I turn it over to my colleagues, let's go back to Mabel Reed. Mabel was his young nurse, went to work for him. She wound up leading the VMSC, or this ambulance corps, in the 40s, 50s, right till Boston died. We also believe at the time there was no woman running an ambulance corps in the United States. And right now, if you look at ambulance corps and EMS workers, it's a male-dominated profession even to this day. To have a woman running things back in the 30s and 40s, again, almost unheard of, but it goes back to Boston's character. You know, he wanted the best person for the job, period. So while he's breaking his own barriers, he's allowing others to also assume jobs and responsibilities that at the time, again, was unheard of, which, you know, just brings us to, you know, this movement that we have started, that we will get to the White House. Mabel stays with him till his death. She was one of the big proponents, of course, of the movement to have that monument built and to have the bronze face looking at the steps of the old hospital. The older folks that I interviewed all would acknowledge they used to go to the Boston farm and always thought that was Mrs. Boston. But they never married. And I only have one photograph where they're staring at each other in this photo, and there would be no question. If I put this on the screen right now and you looked at it, you'd be like, yes. Now that is a loving couple. Other times in the public, they were always very professional, somewhat apart. And I'm thinking, oh, come on, there's got to be more to this. I'm rooting for them. So I start tracking Boston's movements. And he would leave the country and go to England and Vienna, Austria. He was a member of the Vienna, Austria Medical Society. And he would take boats. I found him on the Queen Elizabeth. I found him on some other ships because, you can track coming and goings. So I find him, I'm doing all these things, and I find this cruise to nowhere. It's a 9-day cruise, leaves New York, goes to the Caribbean, and goes back to New York. It's like don't hold me to the exact date, somewhere around maybe 46, 47. But I'm saying to myself, wait a second, I got all these. A doctor kind of cruising the Caribbean by himself, something's not right. And can I get a hold of the entire passenger manifest? The answer is yes, I could. And the answer is yes. I'm scared. Mabel Reed. And I was actually so happy to see that because I'm thinking, gotchas. You actually were able to go on a cruise somewhere and enjoy each other out of sight, because no matter what good he did for our country or his community, that relationship simply was forbidden at the time, and neither one wanted to challenge it. I'll also add, upon his death, he's buried in a cemetery called White Marsh. Now, the rest of the Bostons are buried in the Eden Cemetery. Eden is E-D-E-N. It's down in Chester County, Pennsylvania. It's one of the oldest African-American cemeteries in the country. And all the Bostons are there. His brother's there, his mom, his dad. And I'm thinking, why isn't Boston with the Bostons? Because he never married. Why is he at White Marsh? So, of course, curiosity gets the best of me. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, yes, that's where the Reed family is buried. And eventually that is where Mabel Reed is buried. So I always, when I tell the story, say, hey, they got after life what, for many reasons, they couldn't have during life, which is somewhat of the Greek tragedy in all of this. But that's what brings us out here. I hope my next project, trying to highlight some of the other officers from this fort, as well as the postage stamp in partnership and collaboration with the great volunteers at this fort. This is about my 4th or 5th trip out here, and every time I come out here, I learn something new and something more. My apologies for having to talk and not be able to show you some of the images that we had. But I also want to bring up Uli, and Uli is in Drake Law School now. She would go to a lot of the schools and groups to present the story because she would connect, especially with some of the students of color, different students, and even younger people. I mean, she would do more of the connecting, and I wanted her to at least say a few words as to why she got involved with us and why this project is important. And then, of course, I won't torture my son and make him come up here, but we'll commend him for trying to get this stamp project off the ground. So with that, I'll turn it over to Uli.
Hey. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited to be up here. I'm a little rusty. It's been a minute since I've been under these wonderful roofs of Fort Des Moines, but I am very happy to be back. Every time I come, I learn something new. In fact, I just learned something new from George about Mabel Reed. That's an incredible story. The Dr. Boston story is one that caught my attention a couple years ago. It is something that, much like everybody else, my reaction was, how incredible, and then why do I not know about this? I am a young black female, and I find that I do a lot of research within African American history, but I had no idea considering that that was a hospital that I also went to for an emergency, the fact that it was founded by a black man at the time that it was is incredible, and I had no idea. So of course, figuring out the story with George and seeing all that he accomplished, I find that he has been somebody that I'm really standing on his shoulders. He was in STEM at a time that I did not know even any African Americans were in STEM. And I just found that to be incredible. And throughout my undergrad experience and just learning about this story, I was so inspired that I thought other students would benefit to hear from it. So that was really my motivation to get involved and come out here and really spread his message. And I find it so inspiring that he accomplished everything that he did in the face of such adversity. And it really kind of makes me question, what is my excuse, you know? Why can't I do it? And hopefully I can do it, so we'll see in a couple years. But going through law school, which has been an incredible challenge, I find that I often think about Dr. Boston and I think about the potential experiences he's had. And it really is just incredible to think about how he might have gone through things. And I often say, what would Dr. Boston do? And hopefully I get the answer right more often than not. But it has been kind of a very, I feel like I am well taken care of every time I think about just his story and who he is as a person. Because besides just his incredible accomplishments, one of the themes that we saw within the people that we interviewed that did know him is just how incredibly kind of a man that he was. And that is one of my motivating factors in terms of how I treat people. And with the comic book, that is one of the messages that we wanted to show young people, is that, you know, you can be this incredible person in everybody's life and still be humble and still be kind and still carry yourself with a level head on your shoulders. And it's just little tidbits of Dr. Boston's life. I mean, he never carried himself as if he was more important than anybody else. And that is something that I really kind of take from him. And we want young students to see that. We want all students, but especially students of color who do not often have figures like this to look back on throughout history. A lot of our history, especially Black history, is very traumatic. So it is nice to be able to see figures like Dr. Boston who really inspire more than they hurt. And I think that it's just very, very important that young students especially grow up learning about heroes, real heroes, you know, who lived and worked and inspired and loved. And I'm just very happy to be a part of this project, and I thank you all again. I'm very happy to be back in Fort Des Moines. I have not been here for a minute, so thank you for having me.
No, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a tough act to follow. That's why I went first. So if I had to follow that for the whole time, it would be difficult. But again, thank you all for coming. We did the best we could under the circumstances. That is the insignia. If you look up there at the top, that's the insignia that he designed for the ambulance corps, which is still used to this day. And of course, him in his uniform smiling, he was very proud. And there were true patriots. I mean, the whole Boston family. And that was, and I'll end on that note, because I think one of the things I found that was remarkable is not only his father, but Boston and then his brother, they really loved their country. And when the country was in need, despite doors pretty much being shut on them, it was still that I still want to help for the greater good. And I think that's the message we try to get out there, is that, you know, we have to be more understanding, we have to be more accepting, because it benefits all of us at the end of the day. I'm very proud of Uwe. She's worked closely with me for the Boston Project since the beginning. My son, along with 4 or 5 different of our area colleges, our high schools, our community groups that have all jumped on board to support this. So we're going in the right direction. Keep an eye out, though. I'm not stopping, and I've said this many times, till I either get Michelle or Jill Biden to hold up our comic and say, this is a story that needs to be told, and each step we get closer. The Pentagon last July 4th flew a flag for us. We did an event in DC. The US military sent the 9-member Presidential Honor Guard to our event at the World War I Memorial. So we're hitting all the right notes, and I just need that one more move so that nationwide the story of Boston, along with so many from this fort, get told. So that is my parting comments. Afterwards, I'll be happy to answer any questions or anything of that nature. But thank you all for coming. And again, my apologies, but I think we got the story out there, which is what was important. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
There's a phrase that we hear at the fort all the time, and we heard it a couple times today. And that phrase is, "I had no idea." And I grew up here. I've driven by this fort hundreds of times as a kid. I worked at the Southridge Target. Right? I know this area and had no idea, not just about Dr. Boston, but about anything of any significance ever happening whatsoever, which is not only the purpose of the speaker series to try and draw attention to the men and women who served here, but the purpose of the fort. And so please spread the word about the fort, spread the word about the speaker series, spread the word about the stories of the men and women who served here. We have 5 more of these that we will be scheduling. Keep looking at our Facebook and our website to know when those are scheduled. We will continue to focus on not just the black officers who trained here, but the female officers who trained here for World War II, and perhaps even the cavalry officers who served here before 1917 as part of the Fort Des Moines legacy and history. But the connection points are everywhere. We talk about Louis at Drake Law School. There's connections. Charles Howard, who is a graduate of Fort Des Moines, graduates from Drake Law School, starts the Iowa Negro Bar Association. I mean, there's connections to real, legitimate, important civil rights history, and what they all have in common is this place here, and hopefully we can continue to draw attention to it. So thank you all very much for coming. You are welcome to wander the museum and learn more of those stories here today. Check our Facebook or our YouTube page for the video of today's presentation, and please share it widely. And if you have any questions for George or Uli, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.